Hello, my name is Kayla Malone, and I'm the Chaffey County Noxious Weed Program Supervisor. Today we're going to be discussing gardens, weeds, and noxious weeds. What are the connections? So today we're going to be discussing weeds, noxious weeds, and invasive plants, specifically to discuss what is the difference between these different categories. We're going to move into gardens and noxious weeds and the connections there. From there, we'll move into control strategies that can be used for management and control of all undesired species, move into weed and vegetation life cycles, and finally wrap up with tips for successful weed control. So, people and plants. What's the connection? Well, most plants in horticulture and agriculture that we use today are not native to North America. These imported plants have value to people. They do something for us. Most of these plants have natural processes in place that limit their populations. When they escape from these natural processes and from their intended locations to other areas is when their effects can be detrimental. Horticulture itself is a direct pathway for invasive species introductions, though it's definitely not the only direct pathway. So let's dig into it a little bit more. Specifically, what makes a garden species successful in our region? Well, garden species that are wildlife resistant tend to thrive. Those that have the ability to persist on a site without additional introductions are beneficial. They thrive in a range of soil types. They're drought resistant and low water use. They thrive in a range of habitats and sites. They tend to be pest resistant. They have long blooming periods and the ability to outcompete weedy species. Awesome, great characteristics we want for our garden plants. But what about noxious weeds? What makes a noxious weed species potentially successful in our region? Well, they're wildlife resistant. They have the ability to persist on a site without additional introductions. They thrive in a range of soil types. They can be drought resistant with low water use. They persist in a range of habitats. They tend to be pest resistant, have long blooming periods, and the ability to outcompete our native species. As you can tell from there, right there, the same characteristics that we select for our gardens are the same characteristics that make noxious weed species so successful in our region and other regions. So noxious weeds themselves are a much bigger problem than garden nuisances. But why? Well, plants themselves are an active component of an ecosystem. Let's think for a minute, what are some reasons, besides just visual appearance, that people manipulate vegetation? Well, we plant vegetation specifically to support pollinators, to provide habitat structure for different types of wildlife, to provide food for wildlife, to stabilize slopes, to engage in water conservation and water purification, to provide shade or windbreaks, to do erosion control or engage in nutrient fixing. We can remove trees and vegetation to improve safety and visibility, or add vegetation to improve and increase privacy. Plants are an active component of our ecosystem. So let's take a moment to review our food chains and food webs. Grass absorbs sunlight and water to grow and produce green tissues. These green tissues are consumed by the first level or primary consumers, in this example, a grasshopper. These primary consumers are then consumed by higher level trophic species, again in this example, a frog, who's then later consumed by a snake, and then finally by our upper level predators, in this example, a hawk. After that hawk passes away, it'll be decomposed through fungi or other organisms that break down and recycle those nutrients, creating this food chain or web. So what does this system look like when we look at all of the different trophic interactions of a single species? Well, the example you can see on your screen here is from a paper of lemmings and snowshoe hares. The species in the center, highlighted in yellow, is the focal target species. In each of these models, they demonstrate all of the different types of vegetation on which the focal species depends, and then models all of the species which depend on the focal species for later consumption. As you can see, even looking at these from a single species interaction, it starts to get very complex. Take a moment and imagine What do you think it looks like if we model an entire ecosystem? Wow, right? That's really an amazing, amazing model. This is from a paper, Keystone Species and Food Webs. The key takeaway here is this ecosystem, this model, is resilient. Each one of those black bars demonstrate a different type of trophic interaction or connection, and each pink dot is a separate species. This area, this site could experience drought, wildfire, or other disturbance mechanisms and still survive or even thrive through that. So what does it look like in real life? Well, let's take an example of our high alpine ecosystems. When we take a look at just this photo alone, we see there's a lot of complexity. We've got many, many different species of flowering plants, which provide food resources for a range of insects and small mammals. We've got a different type of vegetation in the background here, a shrub cover, and even some tree cover, providing again more food resources and more habitat for more diversity. We've got a low-lying wetland area, which provides the ability to be resilient to flood and water events. We have an upland slope with exposed soil, again providing more habitat for different species. We've got a grassy vegetated slope in the back, again providing yet different habitat structure for different species. In the foreground here, we have an incredible forage value that provides lots of resources to lots of vegetation eaters. And finally, open surface water to allow for wildlife to have access easily to the resources they need, and tree cover, again, providing yet a different type of habitat and food source for the species here. As you can see, we've got dozens of plant species, at least 6 unique habitat types, a wide range of food input for wildlife, a wide range of habitat structure for wildlife. We've got surface water available. We've got nutrient inputs for soil. The site has water holding capacity and is adaptable to a wide range of environmental conditions. This area has a very complex food web, similar to that last model you saw. But what happens when we start to get invasive species or regulated noxious weeds into these scenes or environments? Well, in this example here, this bright yellow plant that you can see in between the sagebrush is leafy spurge. It is a B-list noxious weed in the state of Colorado that has the proven ability to outcompete grasses, forbs, and have major impact on our ecosystems. In this example, leafy spurge itself has not yet excluded other vegetation from the site, though we do see that biodiversity itself is impacted. We do start to see some effects on ecosystem function. With leafy spurge, because of its toxicity, wild ungulates or grazing mammals tend to avoid areas with large populations of it. But once you lose your wild ungulates and grazing mammals, you no longer have the nutrient input, fertilizer, or turning hoof action that these ecosystems depend. From a weed management perspective, it's far more cost-effective to control and manage the leafy spurge at this stage of invasion than with a full-on monoculture. When comparing this ecosystem to the last one we looked at, it has a less complex food web. It is less resilient to ecosystem changes, and we're starting to see some big impacts. Now, if left unchecked, imagine what this could look like. Yeah, leafy spurge has absolutely taken over. As you can see from this photo, there's limited or no other vegetation. Because of this elimination of other vegetation, we've also eliminated the ecosystem functions on which a healthy habitat depends. We've got a loss of food for wildlife, loss of habitat, almost a full elimination of wildlife, and a very simple food web. This is ecosystem collapse. And so let's take a look at a model of how this could potentially work. In this example, we're looking at sagebrush steppe ecosystem. Cheatgrass can invade the sagebrush steppe ecosystem and outcompete directly with our forbs and shrubs. Can you imagine if we eliminate our flowering plants and our sagebrush from that ecosystem? What happens? Yeah, it simplifies. we lose a lot of the biodiversity and the components that create the ecosystem itself. And unfortunately, when it comes to noxious weeds and invasive plants, we've seen this process over and over and over again, each on a different scale and with different impacts. And so, what are the objectives of noxious weed management? Well, it's my objective to project ecosystem function, to reduce the negative impacts of noxious weeds on natural, semi-natural, and human-manipulated lands. An objective of noxious weed management is to match the land use goals with the appropriate treatment efforts, and manage the risks associated with both noxious weed infestations and the treatments we have available. So let's get right into it. What are some of our options for control strategies? Well, the first of which is prevention. Prevention is any action or activity that is used to stop the spread of weeds. This can include cleaning your equipment, planting certified seed, using certified hay, appropriate fertilization, appropriate pasture rotation, making sure you're supporting healthy pasture functions. Make sure you have weed-free edges of roadsides, walking paths, and areas outside of pasture, ranges, and right-of-ways, as well as homes. Some benefits for engaging in prevention strategies is that it's always the most cost-effective method for control. It doesn't cost very much to wash our equipment or to walk a pasture edge or to keep areas weed-free. Additionally, there's no negative ecological impacts, either by the weed species or by the treatment actions. There are some cons with prevention, and that's that it requires diligent action. If you skip washing your equipment or your vehicles even a single time, that may be the introduction of a much bigger problem. And it does require knowledge of the weed threats in the area. In order to effectively maintain weed-free edges, you need to know which weeds are in the area and part of the community that may be invading your edges. So here's a few photos that actually came from our equipment from me working. And in both of these examples, you can see viable seed materials that were picked up and moved by our equipment. In the first picture on the left is a good example of the volume of biological material that gets caught on the skid plates of our four-wheelers. The next photo is a picture of scentless chamomile. Scentless chamomile has the unique characteristic of being able to produce viable seeds anytime a flower is already present. That means that that flower itself, if it dried off and fell off, could become the initial colonization of a whole new invasion. Really, really important to clean your gear. When it comes to recreation, there's also potential options for the accidental transportation or movement of biological materials. These could be hitchhikers stuck to your boots, shoes, or, as you can see in that next picture, our pets. For my previous job, I worked for a military base in Minnesota, and it was our job to go out and identify areas of risk. In this case, in this example, you can see a photo of the characteristic damage of when a vehicle, in this case a tank, leaves the trail, conducts a maneuver, and then enters back onto the trailway. Now, if that tank is clean, we're able to go back out there, mitigate the site, eliminate the divots, and monitor for issues. But if that equipment is not clean, it can be the very beginning of a new infestation. Can you see there the two lines where tracks were? In this example, that vehicle was likely to have traveled through an area that had viable seed material before engaging in this maneuver in a field, directly inoculating the site. So a little bit of cleaning could have prevented this. Another category for control strategies are cultural controls, which these are practices which reduce pest establishment, reproduction, dispersal, and survival. Some examples can include alterations in irrigation patterns, moving to flood irrigation instead of drip irrigation, or vice versa, seeding of desirable plants, utilizing weed-free hay for livestock, cleaning equipment, gears, tools, and supplies frequently. As you can see, there's a lot of overlap with cultural controls and prevention tools. Cultural controls themselves are most effective when used as prevention tools. They are much less effective in controlling established plants. Our cultural controls, much like our preventatives, have limited negative ecological impacts. Unfortunately, depending on your situation, these processes of cultural control can be relatively labor intensive when it comes to moving pipe, moving water, and it can be very costly when used as a control technique, as well as not necessarily always effective. Mechanical controls are any management strategy or technique that uses physical options to kill existing plants. These can be hand pulling out individual plants. It can be the use of a shovel to remove underground root materials, or in larger situations, tilling, disking, or mowing are all examples of mechanical control strategies. Some benefits to mechanical control strategies is that it is suitable for a range of infestation sizes. Hand pulling or removal with a shovel is very appropriate on the small scale with individual plants. Tilling and mowing can be effective in larger scale situations. Now, it can be effective at controlling some species, which we'll get into as we discuss life cycles, as well as having quick effects. Do not undervalue the benefit of quick effects. There's something incredibly satisfying about no longer having to see that weedy plant. Unfortunately, it can be labor intensive. Mechanical controls can be difficult over larger scales. Generally, it needs to be repeated annually or more frequently, depending on the life cycle. And it can be really, really challenging to implement for extremely large-scale infestations. And by large-scale infestations, I mean 10+ acres of monocultures. In the case of non-selective options like tilling, mowing, and disking, it can damage or kill the non-targeted plants that we're trying to promote. Physical removals can create disturbances themselves, which can be reinvaded if not managed appropriately. And if not reseeded or, again, managed appropriately, mechanical controls can actually increase both erosion and topsoil loss. How about biological control? Well, the biological control options are the use of natural enemies such as predators, parasites, pathogens, and competitors to control plants and their impacts. The benefits with approved regulated biocontrol is they tend to be species-specific level controls, meaning we have limited non-target or off-target damages. Some benefits include that once established, these populations are self-perpetuating and self-sustaining, and it can be the most cost-effective method at reducing the impacts of highly established plant populations. In the situation where we have large-scale monocultures, biological controls are sometimes the best, long-term, most cost-effective option. In the case of biological control agents, new species and new techniques are constantly being researched, so there's always the potential to have better, more efficient tools in the future. There are some cons with biological control as well. Unfortunately, they will not eliminate their targeted species populations. Nothing will ever completely eat itself out of house and home, and we see that natural pattern repeated with biocontrol agents as well. The biological control agents themselves are expensive to develop and approve for use, and they're generally not effective for small populations or populations of plants that are not well established across a large region. Additionally, you can experience a high rate of failure when using biological control agents. These are living species, living creatures, and therefore are sensitive to habitat sites, conditions, and environmental changes over time. Herbicide controls. Herbicide controls are the use of crop-protecting chemicals used to kill weedy plants or interrupt normal plant growth. There are some pros with herbicide usage, being that they tend to be convenient in usage. They tend to be cost-effective, depending on the scale. They do reduce tillage, soil disturbance, and soil erosion when compared to mechanical control efforts. Herbicide products themselves can be selective to limit off-target damage. I say can be because a lot of the products that most homeowners are familiar with are slightly selective or not selective at all. A lot of the products that I use in my professional career are very selective, meaning they're only active on a narrow range of species in the environment. Herbicide controls themselves can be cost-effective on both large and small infestations, depending on the species. As you've seen with all these control methods, there are some cons associated with them as well. In the case of herbicide controls, some of the cons include a risk to human, environmental, and ecological health, the very things we're trying to protect. I find that herbicide controls requires pretty extensive knowledge to ensure efficacy and safety in applications. Additionally, many factors influence what herbicides should be used, when, where, and on what species. Within herbicides themselves, there are several different types that have pretty significant impacts on how these products operate or function in an ecosystem. The first category I like to discuss is contact versus systemic. Herbicide types that are contact in nature mean that they're absorbed directly at the location they're applied to and engage in whatever activity at the site of application. Systemic products are those products that are able to be applied, say at the leaf surface, but then translocate within the plant itself to the area of action, down to the roots, or perhaps the vascular system. There are products that are selective and products that are non-selective. A selective product that you might be familiar with would be a grass-safe herbicide or something with a 2,4-D based product. These products are selective for flowering plants and tend to not damage grasses. Non-selective products are those that damage or impact all vegetation. An example you might be familiar with is glyphosate. Glyphosate is a non-selective herbicidal product. And then finally, pre-emergence versus post-emergence. Pre-emergence have to be applied before the vegetation has emerged from the ground surface, and post-emergence are designed to be applied directly to green growing tissues. So these characteristics are not individualistic and unique. They do work in combination with each other. As an example, you can have contact products that are non-selective in nature, herbicide products such as diquat. We generally don't have any contact products that are selective in nature because the nature of a contact product is physically impacting the leaf's tissue or surface. And because it's physically impacting that surface, it's not selective in one way or the other. We also have products that are systemic and selective, meaning you apply at the leaf surface and they're able to translocate to a different area of action, and selective in nature, meaning they won't impact all vegetation on a site. An example I use quite often in my program is Milestone, which is an ideal herbicide product for thistles. An example of a non-selective product, meaning it'll kill everything, but systemic in nature, meaning able to move throughout the plant system, would be glyphosate. As a quick note, always read and follow the label. The label is the law. If you're unsure of what herbicides to use or how to use them, and you're a resident in Chaffee or Lake counties, please contact me. I may be able to help you. And so my program, one of my goals, is to utilize integrated weed management, which is the use of cultural, mechanical, chemical, biological controls, as well as preventative measures together to reduce pest survival, infestations, and reproduction. This process works to identify weaknesses in the pest life cycle to ensure efficient, adequate control. It is, in my opinion, the only way to eradicate established populations, and the only option to prevent new species from establishing is through an integrated weed management program. Now let's shift gears and discuss plant life cycles and management based on these plant life cycles. The first life cycle I'd like to discuss are annual species. Annual species are those plants that germinate, mature, flower, and produce seed in a single year. Summer annuals germinate in the spring, mature, flower, produce seed, and die back by fall, whereas winter annuals can germinate in the fall, overwinter in this germinated state, and then the following spring and summer mature, flower, produce seed, and dies back, typically by early summer. Some examples in our area of annual species includes horseweed, which is not a state-listed noxious weed, but can be problematic depending on your situation or scenario. Puncture vine is an annual species that is a C-list noxious weed. Russian thistle and kochia are both common components of our ecosystem here in Chaffee County, Colorado, and are commonly referred to as our tumbleweed species. Biennials are those plants that germinate and grow for a year, typically in a rosette form, that then overwinter. The following season, those rosettes mature, flower, set seeds, and then die back afterwards. In the photos here, these are all state-listed noxious weeds. Common mullein, a C-list species, houndstone, a B-list species, and bull thistle, also a B-list species. So when it comes to controlling annuals and biennials, it's definitely relatively easier when compared to controlling our creeping perennials. In the case of annuals and biennials, persistence pays off. In order to effectively control annuals and biennials, we only have to engage in two specific strategies for management. The first of which is preventing seed production. In this example, remove all plants before allowing them to go to seed. And then secondly, deplete the seedbed, or repeat the methods for preventing seed production for the expected life of the seedbed. In some circumstances, you can create ideal conditions for germination and then control those plants before they set seed. Some options for control of annuals and biennials. Well, in order to prevent seed production, hand pulling can be very effective. Mowing can be effective for upright or tall species, and both pre-emergent and post-emergent herbicides are options. When it comes to depleting the seedbed, I typically only recommend engaging in actions to trigger germination only if you have serious infestations or plants with long seed expectancies. Tilling the site can induce germination by allowing more seeds exposure to the soil surface, or hoeing also can increase seed exposure at the soil surface. Regardless of which method you decide to employ, if you decide to employ it, follow-up seed production control is absolutely critical to success. Another category of plants I'd like to discuss are perennials. Perennials are those plants that germinate and grow. Individual plants may or may not set seed during the first year of growth, but the plant itself does not die back after maturing, flowering, and producing seeds. In the photos you see here, they are all examples of our state-listed noxious weeds and are all perennials. Perennials themselves can be divided into two biological categories: those that I consider simple perennials, or those that reproduce and spread by seed only. Most typically have a taproot in their root structure, or the category of creeping perennials. This is the category of perennials that have the ability to reproduce from root fragments, runners, rhizomes, stolons, or other modified tissues, as well as by seeds. When it comes to controlling simple perennials, it's similar to annuals and biennial control with one additional step. We would, number one, have to prevent seed production. In the case of perennials, we also have to work to kill or remove existing plants. It's going to be necessary for preventing next year's seed production. And then you've got to deplete the seedbed, or repeat the methods of control for the life expectancy of the seedbed, or create ideal conditions for germination, and then control those plants before they set seed. When it comes to control of simple perennials, for just preventing seed production, which is necessary to make sure the populations don't get worse, mowing or hand pulling above ground materials are both appropriate options. In order to work to kill existing plants, you can sever the taproot, dig out the root system and root structure, or appropriately applied herbicides are options for killing existing plants. Now when it comes to depleting the seedbed, as we mentioned previously, only recommended in situations with severe infestation, but tilling of a site with follow-up control can be appropriate for depleting the seedbed, or an appropriate selective pre-emergent herbicide can also be beneficial in helping to deplete the seedbed, though will have to be repeated on a yearly basis. So, understanding the seedbed. How does it all work? And how do our different options for control and management have an impact in this? Well, a seed has to arrive onto the site via dispersal. From there, it enters the soil seed bank, which includes dormant and non-dormant seeds. Well, once that seed germinates, it then grows, produces flowers, and sets seed. These seeds then rain back onto the site, creating additional deposits into the soil seed bank. This is the seed bank cycle. There are ways for these seeds to leave the seed bank beyond just germination, and that's through soil pathogens, which our non-native species don't have a lot to take advantage of, taking advantage of it because they're non-native. They can die through deep burial. They can have physical damage that prevents germination, or the seeds themselves may just not be viable, known as seed mortality. Ways that seeds can leave the soil seed bank above ground can include predation and consumption. Again, not a strong factor as our non-native species have escaped. So when it comes to management and control, how does it really intersect or engage with this cycle? Well, our options for cultural control and prevention help ensure that we never have an initial dispersal onto the site. Even then, once it happens, and you know it's there, we have the ability to impact germination through pre-emergent herbicides. If you haven't had the opportunity to engage before this stage, even once those plants have flowered, or begun growing, flowering, and producing seeds, we have the option to control through mechanical controls or herbicidal options. Let's say you missed them at that window and they were able to produce flowers. We still have mechanical options for removing those above ground seeds and physically disposing of them through bagging or burning, which will prevent seed rain. Each of these opportunities in the seed cycle are opportunities for us to engage and reduce the future pressures. So what about creeping perennials? Well, in my opinion, creeping perennials are the most difficult types of plants to control. They have the ability to regrow from tiny, tiny root fragments left in the soil. And in these cases, early detection and rapid response are by far the most cost-effective options for management. Once they're really well established and the system's inundated, it can be extremely expensive, to reduce these infestations. Well-established populations of creeping perennials will require intensive controls to mitigate and manage those infestations. So, when it comes to controlling our creeping perennials, we must prevent seed production, which is absolutely critical to preventing new plants. We must work to kill existing plants, which is necessary for preventing future seed production. We must work to deplete the energetic availability of the root systems, which is necessary for killing existing plants. And then we must work to deplete the seed beds, or repeat those methods of control for the expected seed longevity, or work to create ideal conditions for germination and control those plants before they set seed. So when it comes to control of our creeping perennials, there are several different options available, just like we've had previously, plus a couple more steps. When it comes to preventing seed production, mowing or hand removal of above-ground materials are both potentially viable options. When it comes to working to killing existing plants, an appropriate selective herbicide application is recommended. Tilling, hand pulling, or other mechanical methods can be effective and appropriate, but will require the appropriate selective herbicide treatment for follow-up. In this case, you must deplete the root system. As an example, you must frequently treat shoot regrowth with the appropriate selective herbicide, and then finally work to deplete the seedbed, or engage in tilling, disking, or hand pulling first with follow-up post-emergent herbicides, or potentially utilize pre-emergent herbicides for the control of creeping perennials. And so what are some of my tips for noxious weed control? Well, conduct mechanical treatments before flowers and seeds develop. In the case of a few of our noxious weed species, as soon as there's flowers, there's viability there. So make sure if you're going to engage in mechanical, you do so before seeds are present. If seeds are present from the previous year, make sure to remove these before conducting or engaging in mechanical treatment and ensure you don't spread those further. Do not compost seeds, flowers, or root materials, particularly with home compost systems or systems that do not get hot enough to fully eliminate these. And we recommend that you bag up and place your refuse in a container specifically for landfill disposal. My office and shop location is the landfill, and so we have a system in place to monitor edges and perimeters and ensure that these seeds are not escaping from that site. Prevention, as you heard me mention at the beginning, is always the most cost-effective management plan. Always, always. Avoid wildflower mixes if you're unsure of any of the species in it, particularly if they're generated from areas out of state. Only purchase plants from reputable dealers, and if you're engaging in person-to-person trade, be sure you know what plants you're getting. Educate your neighbors about the risks of noxious weeds in their yards and gardens. As you've seen, they can quickly spread and take over areas. So keep in mind, we're all in this together. And so what are the keys to successful weed management? In order to really be successful with weed management, you've got to first define your land use, goals, and objectives. What is it you're trying to accomplish? Why are you trying to remove these weeds? You must then identify the species you're trying to control and make sure that you understand their life history traits and what control options you have available based off those life history traits. From there, conduct your management activities based off of these specific targeted species traits and your land use objectives. From there, monitor and evaluate your treatment effects in order to determine if they meet your land use goals, and adjust those treatment efforts based on your results. If anyone would like assistance as a Chaffee County or Lake County resident, let me know, and I'll do my best to help you out with developing a weed management plan. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I am the Chaffee County Noxious Weed Program Manager, and through IGA, I also help manage Lake County here in Colorado. And so the services that my program offers are on-site consultations, weed species identification, integrated weed management plan development and assistance. We can engage in herbicide treatments on private and public properties. I can assist you with herbicide applications and label interpretation. I can help coordinate volunteer service projects, and then finally engage in public education and outreach opportunities. With that, I will see if anyone has any questions or comments. If so, please send me an email at kmalone@chaffeecounty.org, and I'll do my best to get back to you. Thanks, and have a great day.